Cosgrove.
Just heard the age-old sort of explanation for providing massive tax cuts for the wealthy and very few cuts or assistance for the middle and low income. It's called trickle-down. Now, it didn't work for Thatcher and it didn't work for Reagan, and these geniuses over there are sort of clawing back in history because they haven't got any innovative vision or policy to the old trickle-down theory, which for the uninitiated, so I'm told, goes like this: that if you fund massive tax cuts to those on the top, first step. So what did they do? Top 10% got 40% of the tax cuts. So they put a tick, income tax, they put a tick in the box there. So the theory goes, if you give massive income tax cuts to those on the top, then somehow, in some quasi-religious beneficial way, those at the top will shell out these wonderful $100 notes and they will trickle down to the masses, the proletariat, those poor souls at the bottom that have very little income, scrape for it every day and cannot make ends meet. And from this great trickle-down theory, nirvana will occur. Everybody will be rich. Everybody will be better off. Unemployment will disappear. Economic growth will be sparked. The veil will fall from the temple, as I'm sure Mr. Clark would know from his religious experience, and all will be well. Well, there's a wee problem with that, because it hasn't actually worked. It did not work for Margaret Thatcher. It did not work for Ronald Reagan. George Bush had a crack as well. It just doesn't work. It is a bankrupt, invalid economic policy. But oh no, these guys are dusting it off yet again for the last 4 years and having another crack. Having another crack. And John Hayes, who's sort of, with a haircut like that, looks like he's sort of morphing or sort of channeling Peter Dunn. John Hayes, I got to say, he's lost the bow tie though, that's true. John Hayes, I got to say, because this bill comes on the back of a series of botched tax proposals, like, as my colleague said, the car park tax, which John Hayes, I got to say, he won't thank me for saying it, but I got to pay tribute to him, showed a ton of guts to our Johnny. He opposed the car park tax in the privacy of the select committee room where it was not public. He opposed it on principle grounds, and I admire him for that. Always shows a ton of guts, does John Hayes. He opposed the iPad tax. He had some real problems with the student loan tax, of course. I think he also opposed the paperboy tax. These groundbreaking reforms that the National Party sort of bring into this House. Well, it just shows how bankrupt these people are. Because on the back of those botch-ups, and on the back of that, we have this sort of trickle-down theory, which is not working. Now, they talk about they gave a bit in GST. So they bumped the tax rates up, they dropped the tax rates down, the top 10% get 40% of them, John Key gets $1,000 a week, the new minister, who I should congratulate Mr Macleay, not a bad chair of FEC, wish him well in a limited way, but $100 a week Mr Macleay did get. Now he's gone up a bit because his salary's doubled. And those on the middle and low incomes, those who actually spend money and actually grow the economy because they have no choice but to spend their income, they haven't got any spare money to save, they can't ferret it away, often they have mortgages and debt, they actually have to spend their money on school shoes and school fees and food and basic things like that. And electricity, of course, which apparently is very competitive, and no one's paying too much for their electricity, according to the national government, in their small, myopic bubble of a little world, which no one believes. But if you actually want to grow the economy, what these guys could have done is did what the Aussies did. And that is target the tax cuts, one, at those who need it, and two, those who are going to spend it, and those who are going to create jobs by spending that money that they get back, their own money, not giving it to the top as these guys did, because the most wealthy do two things. They've got a ton of dough anyway, so what do? They either retire debt with their tax cut, or they save it and put it in the bank. Or buy more champagne. So they're not actually providing the juice and the lifeblood that the economy needs by getting those dollars moving. But of course, over there, they look after their mates. And it's interesting in this bill, there's talk of a limited amnesty. Well, Peter Dunn was in charge of the bill, and had Peter Dunn been the minister today, I would be asking a simple question. Will that amnesty extend beyond the realm of tax to perhaps Mr Dunn's own misdemeanours and difficulties, will the government extend or accept an amendment, or will somebody propose one for that side that will give Mr Dunn an amnesty for the deeds which he has committed in the last few days? Or is this just confined to tax? Or is the fact that he's been removed from the revenue portfolio is because they're going to extend an amnesty and there would be an inherent conflict of interest, as he stated, as the minister? I don't know. I know this is a simple question. I'm sure somebody can perhaps answer that. The thing about tax, Mr Speaker, and we will support this bill to the Select Committee. We have some reservations over a number of aspects, but we do believe in simplicity. We do believe in transparency and respect of tax. And the other thing you've got to have in tax is confidence in the system. So GST as a tax is a pretty simple tax. It's a transparent tax, and people generally have confidence in it, apart from when they're told in an election it's going to stay at the level it was, and then they're lied to after an election and it's bumped up, of course, for the middle incomes and the low incomes, as this crew did, because they're the ones who pay most of that. So it's got to be transparent, it's got to be simplistic, and people have to have confidence in it. But I argue it also has to be fair. And Mr Hayes got up and made a reasonable, he had a bit of a crack trying to talk about equity and fairness in taxation. Well, this simplifies a whole series of processes. But I don't see anything in this bill that corrects the mass inequity where Mr Hayes' government gave the top 10% 40% of the tax cuts. Now, does anybody over there, I'm not an economist, does anybody over there think providing the top 10%, the most wealthiest in our society, with 40% of the tax cuts and giving certain folk $1,000 a week while others languish down the other end and get a few cents, the odd crumb off the National Party table, do the colleagues across the aisle think that's equitable? Does anybody think that's equitable? Will anybody stand up over there? Maybe I'm going deaf. The silence. Does anybody think that is an equitable proposition? Because presumably they talk about equity, they talk about fairness, they have all these high and mighty visionary words, but when it comes to actually finding some spine, a bit of backbone and standing up for their own policy, I just simply ask them again. I'm happy to yield to them if they'd like. Do they think, does Mr Young, who's woken from his slumber, think that giving to the top 10% a 40% tax cut, while those on the bottom languish, 40% of the tax cuts, I should say, to the top 10%, the top 10% getting 40% of the tax cuts, does Mr Young think that's equitable? Oh, sir, I don't know if the mics aren't working, or maybe I've gone deaf, or something's happened, might have, you know, but silence. So they can't even stand up, they can't even the minister over there who's guarding the shop, can't even stand up, and we'll love the Hansard around this next year, and support the proposition that they put forward, that they believe their own tax policy is equitable and fair. Now I know, in the privacy of his own room, Johnny Hayes will be grinding his teeth saying this isn't fair, this isn't equitable, but the whips won't let the reins off him. The whips won't let the reins off him so he can go public on it. So whilst these tax changes will provide some simplicity, some of them are positive, there is a gap in the detail in some of the superannuation propositions in them. The point about it is there is nothing in this legislation that corrects the mass inequity, the mass unfairness, that now we know even government ministers and members won't even stand up and support. Even Maggie Barry, who's known for sort of dishing it out around the place and being very vocal, won't stand up in this House and say that giving the top 10% a 40% of the tax cut revenue and income is equitable or fair. Because even she knows over the bridge in her patch that no one will believe her. Just like no one believes the government proposition that says people aren't paying too much for power. If they really believe that, and they really believe that their tax policy is fair and equitable, I argue they should go out and make those claims publicly on the stump, on every street corner and every hall in the land, especially about the electricity price issues, and see what sort of a response they get. So I invite Mr Hayes to continue to show a ton of guts and oppose some of these tax proposals. I'd like him to do it publicly, but at least I give him credit for doing it privately. And I invite some of his other colleagues, perhaps, who believe the same way he does, to maybe use his example and step up to the plate.
Good speech.